All right, it is noon on Monday, and that must mean that we're here for another Wisconsin Veterans Museum panel discussion. I'd just like to thank everybody for attending today. We certainly appreciate it. We like to have as many people as possible attend these panel discussions and participate in the discussion itself via questions. On that note, once again, I'll just ask everybody to submit their questions via the chat feature, and we will get to those in turn toward the end of the discussion. Today, we're going to be welcoming our museum director, Mr. Chris Kolakowski, and also our oral historian here at the museum, Mr. Luke Sprague, who was a former Army officer and stationed in Korea. So he's going to add to this discussion about the Korean War and the armistice that followed. Before we get into that real quick, though, I just want to give a quick thank you, as I fix my mask once again, to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in providing these free programs that we're able to offer to our audiences and our community members, not only here just in Madison, but also throughout the state of Wisconsin. And we quite often get people joining us from other parts of the nation as well. So that's one of the benefits of being able to do these virtual programs, is that we really get to expand our audience. And that's something that really excites us. So thank you again to the foundation for your continued support in these free programs. Like I said, and I just want to remind everybody just one more time, if you do have any questions about this program, we will be taking those at the end, and you can submit any questions you have through the chat function that is available through Zoom. And you can submit those questions at any time during the program, but we won't be getting them until the very end. Like I said, today we're welcoming the museum director, Mr. Chris Kolakowski, and also the museum's oral historian, Mr. Luke Sprague. And the topic today is going to be the Korean War and the Korean Armistice. Gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're all interested to hear about this.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. It's great to see everybody today, and welcome to another digital program. As Eric mentioned, gives us a broad reach, and it's a good way to keep our audience engaged. What Luke and I are going to do in a time that we have today is we're going to explore the Korean War. We're going to and also its legacy up to today. A lot of people think that the Korean War started, well, it started on June 25th, 1950 with the invasion of South Korea from North Korea, and we'll talk about that as we go. And a lot of people think the war ended on this day with the armistice, July 27th, 1953, which, if I'm doing my math correctly, is what, 73 years ago? But because the war ended with an armistice, peace remains elusive on the Korean Peninsula. And as a matter of fact, the war is technically still going on, and by some measures, you could argue that this is America's longest conflict. And U.S. troops have continued to cycle through South Korea as a permanent station since basically 1950. And that's one of the reasons we want to include Luke today. He did 2 tours in Korea. I know, Eric, your son is about to go do a tour in Korea. So it's still very much an active duty station. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the Korean War, but we're also going to talk about why it matters today. Of course, it's been in the headlines. The Korean Peninsula has been in the headlines over the last few years, particularly. And so we're going to kind of explore some of this and explore a little bit about Korea. It's not just ancient history, but Korea then, Korea up to today as well. So just kind of as a way to start, I learned a long time ago that you can't do military history without good maps. And so we figured the best way to start this, if I can get my screen share, there we go. Let's start with a map. Let's orient everybody to where we are. This is what's known as Northeast Asia. Let me see if, hopefully everybody can see my cursor. Here's the Korean, thank you, Luke. Here's the Korean Peninsula here, divided into North Korea and South Korea, roughly halfway. The Korean Peninsula is about 400 miles long at its widest point, or its narrowest point, excuse me, right here where the DMZ is in the middle, is about 220 miles in width. So that gives you some idea, some approximate idea of the size of the Korean Peninsula. It's about the size, if I remember correctly, about the size of Illinois, actually, in terms of dimension. Here's China. This is a modern map, by the way. Here's China, People's Republic of China here, Mongolia, Russia, then the Soviet Union. And here's the Japanese home islands, Okinawa down in the very southern tip. And of course, the United States is several thousand miles to the east across the Pacific. Interestingly enough, by the way, and an interesting geographical quirk that I'll share with everybody is that Japan, the latitudes of Japan, from the very northern tip down to the southern end, approximate the latitudes from what is Seattle, Washington, down to San Diego. So basically the continental United States. So this, in fact, the 38th parallel, if you look at a map of Kentucky, I-64 between Louisville and Lexington runs along the 38th parallel. So that gives you, it's just kind of an interesting, this is far away, literally on the other side of the world, but it's actually geographically somewhat similar to us. Just a real quick background, and then Luke, I'll bring you in here if you've got anything you want to mention, is how do we get to two Koreas? And the answer to that is that at the end of World War II in 1945, Japan had ruled Korea as a fiefdom since 1910. And at the end of the war in 1945, they divide Korea administratively on the 38th parallel, which runs right down the middle of Korea, right along about that 50-yard line, right where it's divided today. All troops south of the line in what is now South Korea will surrender to the United States. All troops north of that line in what will become North Korea will surrender to the Soviet Union. And this administrative division soon turns into an international border as the Soviets begin to set up a government up here, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The United States will support the Republic of Korea. In fact, it will be the only UN-recognized government on the peninsula for many decades, which will become South Korea here. And so the division in the years after World War II, the administrative division of Korea, will actually harden into something much more serious. And then, of course, that'll precipitate the war breaking out in June of 1950. But Luke, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add at this point or anything you want to bring up.
Not particularly. I think it's important to point out that the current DMZ is not the 38th parallel. They're somewhat similar, but not completely. And the current Diemshida is actually a slightly different location in terms of, and follows the terrain.
As a matter of fact, since you're mentioning that, let me find my map of the DMZ.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see, I don't think you can see on the map, but the 38th parallel is actually marked very faintly on the map. And it basically runs right across like this. So most of the DMZ, this is the stop line on 73 years ago today. Most of the DMZ actually runs north of that line, except for this little section right here, which is actually south of the 38th parallel, but today is in North Korea. So, but you're right, it absolutely follows the terrain much easier. So why do we go to war in Korea? Well, let me introduce to you a couple of characters here as to why we go to war. These are the two presidents of the respective Koreas in 1950. The man at the top here is Syngman Rhee. He is 70 years old when the war starts. He's the first president of the Republic of Korea. There he is with General Douglas MacArthur, who, by the way, of course, has his own Wisconsin ties, it's worth pointing out. And here they are at the proclamation of the independence of Korea in August of 1948. So he's got a vision of a united Korea as the Republic of Korea, as it was before the Japanese took over in 1910. The communists have advanced this 32-year-old man here, Kim Il-sung, as the president of North Korea. And so he has been basically the leader of that communist puppet regime that has been set up in what is now North Korea. And Luke, you may know this, he's still the president of Korea today, of North Korea today.
Yeah, officially.
Which is pretty impressive since he's been dead since 1994.
The eternal leader.
Yes, that's right. That's right. He's officially the eternal president. It's his grandson that is the leader of North Korea today. And I'll let you kind of talk about the Kim dynasty and anything that you want to add there, Lou.
So the Kim dynasty, of course, the focus is on the leadership in this case, and in this case, the personal family. And generally, what happens is goes to the son, and then to the grandson, and it's a very unique form of dynastic succession. I would call it that. One of the things that makes it interesting in the very near term is I think it was the most current president's sister was involved in CNAT events, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the official title for the current ruler, Kim Jong-un, whose grandson of Kim Il-sung, is the chairman of the State Affairs Commission. So the official president of North Korea still is Kim Il-sung. In fact, people still have his photograph. It literally, I think it's practically every room in certainly every dwelling in North Korea. So, but yeah, this is, so when people say this is ancient history, oh, it happened, 70, 75 years ago. Still very much with us. Still very much with us today. So basically, both men want to unify Korea under their leadership. And the difference is that the communists move first. And they invade South Korea June 25th, as we mentioned, June 25th of 1950. Here's a quick map of the invasion. You can see the 38th parallel marked very, very distinctly. And within about 6 weeks, they control 85% of the peninsula. And it's one of the great stands in American military history that frankly deserves more attention, is the fighting down here along what's known as the Pusan perimeter, 50 miles wide by 100 miles long. And it's the last piece of Korea that we're hanging on to with our fingernails. When you were stationed there, Luke, did you guys study this battle?
No, we studied battles mostly that were north of that. Yeah.
Okay.
I did spend some time at Daegu, and of course the primary presence in Pusan is the naval forces. Yeah.
Okay. What turns the tide here, we're hanging on by our fingernails, the U.S., the Koreans, along with other UN forces as well. What turns the tide, of course, is General MacArthur's invasion at Inchon. And I'll show you this picture here real quick of the Pusan perimeter. This is a young lieutenant. He was 21 when the battle started. By the end and shortly after the war, he's a 4-star general. His name's Paik Sun-yup. And you may have met General Paik, or you probably heard of him, Luke. He died last week at the age of 99. So I just want to mention him in passing. If anybody's interested in his memoir called Pusan the Panmunjom, General Paik, it's a very vivid account of the war. But I wanted to mention that as we passed him. But General MacArthur's landing at Inchon right by Seoul turns the tide. We break out of the Pusan perimeter and come back to the 38th parallel right here. And this is all within the first, 2 months of the war?
Yeah, it's really quick.
Yeah. And so basically, the North Koreans invade South Korea here on June 25th. By October 1st, we're back to the 38th parallel. And at that point, the UN Security Council says, unify Korea if possible. Here's MacArthur at Inchon with some of his aides. Unify North Korea if possible. So they push north toward the Chinese border here at the Yalu River. Chinese say, if you get close to the Yalu, we will be forced to act. Those warnings are discounted in Washington. To simplify the whole discussion, that's a whole program in itself. And then when you can see when the Chinese come in, they force us back down to basically the waist of Korea. And then the fighting will rage in there basically for 6-8 months. And then both sides will start to seek an armistice. And it takes them 2 years to conclude an armistice.
You want to mention the tie-in with current president?
I will. Now's as good a time as any. One of the aspects of the retreat, and another one of those legacies we'll talk about, is as the dashed line right here is basically the limit of UN advance. You've got South Korean forces here. You've got the U.S. 8th Army here, and in the middle is the 10th Corps. of 7th Army Division and 1st Marine Division. When the Chinese attack, the 8th Army begins to retreat. The South Koreans here retire southward, and so does 10th Corps, back to the port of Hungnam. And this becomes the American Dunkirk. Over 12 days, from December 12th to December 24th, 1950, we evacuate over 100,000 U.S., British, and South Korean personnel, complete with equipment. And it's all fought in frigid conditions, by the way. There's some Chinese attacking our positions. The retreat to Hungnam. Here's a map of the retreat to Hungnam. 66 miles through frozen mountains, 4,000 or 5,000 feet high.
It can be very cold in the winter.
Yeah. Oh yes. What, that Siberian winter coming in?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've experienced the winter outside in a Humvee, not a hard shell, with a broken heater. And I can confirm that Korean winters can be very cold. This, of course, is up north, but yeah.
Did your rations freeze like theirs did?
Yeah, hard as a rock. Absolutely.
So what do you do in that situation?
You put it on the back of you put it on the engine block, or you put it somewhere that's warm. You put it under your butt. You put it somewhere that warms up.
That's what these guys had to do. One advantage they had, though, is if you got wounded, the blood froze in the wounds. So they were able to do that. And of course, do you know the story of the Tootsie Rolls with these?
Not really, no.
Tootsie Roll was a code name for mortar shells. And the U.S. Air Force was flying in supplies and actually dropped sections of a bridge that they needed to build over a gorge at one point. And they sent a request for Tootsie Rolls. Well, somebody took it literally in Japan, and so they dropped several cases of Tootsie Rolls to the Marines and to the soldiers. And they very quickly realized this was actually the perfect ration in those weathers, because you could heat it a little bit, you could put it in your mouth, even if it was frozen, and suck on it, get some of the sugar. It's dense enough that when you swallow it, it fills your stomach. And so they continued to request those, and they kept flying Tootsie Rolls in, and a lot of these guys survived on Tootsie Rolls for a week or so, getting back to the Hungnam port. And at some of the reunions, actually, at my last job, we hosted the Frozen Chosin, which is what the group survived this is known as, and they had a case of Tootsie Rolls at their reunion in Norfolk because of that. So yeah, I've never looked at Tootsie Rolls the same way again. But anyway, they retreat to Hungnam and they evacuate. This is some of the evacuation. There's General Arnold of the 10th Corps. And there's no orders as to what to do with the 98,000 Korean refugees who clamor into the port trying desperately to get out as well. And who can blame them? So General Almond, on his own initiative, says, we're going to give every excess shipping space we've got to the Korean refugees. We can't leave these people here. And so they put them on ships. This is one ship, SS Meredith Victory. It's your average Liberty merchant ship, Liberty ship from World War II. You know how many Koreans it held? 14,000. They would pack 5,000 into some of those LSTs. 5 children were born at sea on the way to Busan, and they get them all out before they destroy the port on Christmas Eve, 1950. As you can see right there, that's the destruction of the waterfront right there. Now, why does this matter? Is because two of the people that are evacuated from Hungnam are a couple with the last name of Moon. And 2 years later, they have a son named Jae-in. And that is this guy right here on the right. In 2017, Moon Jae-in became the president of the Republic of Korea. He's the president of Korea today. And when he came here a month after his election for his first state visit to the United States, you know what his first stop was? It wasn't the White House. It was Quantico, where he laid a wreath at the memorial at the Marine Corps, right outside the Marine Corps Museum, to the memorial to the Chosin Hungnam campaign, and said, "Thank you for saving my parents." And he said, at that moment, he said, because of the essential humanity of the United States military, I do not fear for the future of our alliance. And so that's something, here we are talking about something, 70 years ago this December. And it continues to influence geopolitics in Northeast Asia today. And it's just a tremendous human interest story about how the American military really made a difference on the Korean Peninsula. So that's kind of where, that in a nutshell is the war, with the Hungnam evacuation and then the stalemate and the negotiations and everything like that. And you can see with this other photograph here, Luke, and then I want you to talk a little bit about your time on the DMZ and your time in Korea. You can see how since that time, if you look at the photograph on the left that's on display, that's the Korean Peninsula at night from space. And you'll notice the divergent paths that the two Koreas have taken, particularly since the 1960s, and how lit South Korea is. And then right at the DMZ, the lights practically go out, with one exception, and that exception is what I'm circling with my cursor here, and that's Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. But this map shows, in some ways, what was at stake in the fighting from 1950 to 1953. Between the UN and the North Korean and their communist allies. So, Luke, I don't know if you got anything to add, or if you want me to stop sharing and you can start talking about your time in Korea.
I'd like to, on your map there of Korea, I don't have control of your screen here, but if you could bring the arrow down just north of Seoul there, where basically from the island there up to the right where there's a bump out, that's the context of where I served while I was in Korea. And then I'll go ahead and take over, try to share my screen, if that's okay.
There you go.
And I'll try to bring this up. And let's see if we can do this. Let's see here. Is anybody else seeing that? So.
Looks good.
Yeah. So this is the area that we were just talking about. So just so we can understand contextually what we're talking about here, you should be looking at, hold on here. Move this window away from the shared. You can see, you should be able to see a big screen with the river on it in the distance. Does that sound right, Chris?
The photo is still loading, Luke.
Okay, no, it's going to, let's see here. Let's unpause it. Resume share. How about now? It should be, it might be a little blurry. Now you should see a screen of multiple files.
I can see that, yeah.
Okay. Can you see me opening this individual file?
I can see it, but the picture's not open.
Picture's not open. How about now?
The joys of technology.
Yeah, no doubt. Come on. How about now? Can you see it?
Nope.
Okay. Let's, this should have worked. Let's try.
Well, I tell you what, Luke, while you're doing that, while you're trying to get the pictures, let me, if you want, I'll talk just real quick about what the DMZ is, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what exactly it is. There we go. There we go.
Okay, so can everyone see that now? The river in the distance, and it's a blurry picture. Okay, so I'll take the reins, Chris. And
you got it.
So people, so you understand my experience there. I can speak more towards, I was stationed in Korea from 95 to 96, and also 97 and 98 at different times. Now, the DMZ is, the way to think about that is to think about it like a layer cake. It's basically an area where you have two different layers. You have the MDL, which is the demarcation line, and then you have the back sets. So some of you people who have it technically can correct me on this. I want to say it's 2,000 or 3,000 meters, no heavy weapons, and then another 3,000 meters or 3 kilometers further back is, I believe you're allowed mortars up to that point. Now, why I can speak about this is, and most of you who have served in the regular army are already aware of this, is the United States forces pulled back the 2nd Infantry Division and its the previous unit, the 7th ID, from the DMZ years ago. But with that said, when I served in Korea, my responsibility was to make sure that the unit I was in could get communications up to and through up to the DMZ. So part of that responsibility is going to those places that allow you to do that. So Chris, can you see my pointer on here by chance?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
It looks like it's at the top of the lamppost.
Yep, perfect. So we're looking north right now, and this along here is the Inchon River, which to a degree forms kind of a natural boundary. So north of here at the top of the picture, you're going to have the DMZ, which will sit right here where you see this gray line showing here kind of. And basically it follows a bunch of hilltops, basically kind of basically it's the demilitarized zone. It's like a sandwich and you're backed out of the layer cake. So one of the things that the ROK Army, the Republic of Korea, and the United States Army combined as the United States forces in Korea, the United Nations Command, did was pulled back to where I'm standing. So you have positions that overlook the DMZ. So you may not have a large amount of forces forward. You'll have people within the JSA, you'll have units patrolling, but you may not have a massive size of force necessarily forward. Now, within this bubble, or within the JSA, if you can look here back to the left, right about here is the JSA in Panmunjom. That's what you see on your TV screens. It's a bubble within the layer cake. So you'll have people come and go. It's kind of like a tourist site, but it's really not. So, and now it's called Camp Boniface, named for Captain Boniface, with an incident that happened in 1976. So we're going to go ahead and look at this, and as long as it's working, I'm going to try and flip through these and share this experience with you. So, so you understand, on this hilltop and to the north and the south, the United States military, of course, is interfacing and working with the ROK Army, the South Korean Army. So pretty normal. You have to understand as well, the Republic of Korea has always had a 2-year conscription for all males who have to serve in the ROK Army. And they either serve in the ROK Army or they can also alternatively serve with the United States Army, training within the United States Army. Excuse me. So this is up within the JSA, and this is a picture showing in the JSA, we're on the south side, and this of course is a ROK soldier. This over here where you see the concrete divider, it looks a little different. This was 25 years ago, of course. I think they had like asphalt here and dirt here. But when you saw President Trump and is it Un shake hands, and he hands him back across the President of the United States back and forth, this is where that happened. And so everybody understands within these 5 blue buildings, there's roughly 5, you can walk to the north and the south side of the building. That is allowed. You are allowed to cross the room. So, and of course, we're looking into North Korea here. we'll try to flip ahead here. So this line here is the MDL, the military demarcation line, which is the middle of the sandwich. But within that bubble, you're allowed flexibility, supposedly. So that's that. And of course, the ROKs, the South Koreans, and both the North Koreans and the American soldiers are there. Very serious. I know there's been efforts in the last year or two. They may have even downgraded to pistols. And that's an ongoing status of affairs, what state they're in.
How tense was this, Luke? I mean, when you were along either in the Joint Security Area or along the DMZ, how did it feel? And what was the attitude of the people that were, because people die on a DMZ every year.
Yeah, so it's a little deceptive. The way to understand, as it was when I was there and from when my service there, it's very serious. It's deadly serious. So, and actually the JSA, somewhat to a degree, is kind of almost touristy, but that belies what the reality is in the entire DMZ. And we'll go into that. I do think you made a good point. Every day, or not every day, but very often, both, people die in the DMZ. It never makes the news. It can be American soldiers. It could be Korean soldiers. It could be North Korean soldiers. So yeah, the armistice, definitely, yeah. It doesn't, yep, it's there. And the efforts going forward, the thing to understand is very dangerous, deadly dangerous. So we'll go on here. So when you get within the DMZ, there will only be signs or little posts demarcating the center. By that time, you've gotten through the fencing, you've gotten through the security, and you've gone through the minefield. So you're going through these layers. But in the center, it's wide open. And now, so I know President Moon has talked about making it a peace park, and has talked recently within the last 2 years, and even some demining operations at various parts in the DMZ. Those are within the DMZ, so just that sector. One of the things that you should understand is there are minefields and rock drops, roadblocks, and other stuff set throughout South Korea on those approaches to prevent a quick approach by the North Korean army. And they are manned and kept up every day. So here's, of course, the classic picture. You can see the building in the North Korea. You can see a soldier here in this bad photograph. This is the one that's everyone's familiar with, looking across the JSA. The other thing to understand within the JSA, Camp Boniface and the JSA doesn't sit perfectly north and south. It's actually kind of turned. So the demarcation line makes a jog through there, which isn't unusual. It's not perfectly like, oh, there's north and there's south and they correspond.
That's right, because it actually runs northeast, southwest, the way it turns right there. And so yeah, you were actually looking northwest into North Korea at that moment.
Right, exactly. So the other thing to understand, my experience with the North Koreans is whatever you're seeing, if it's being shown, it's very much, this is what we want you to see. And that's that experience. So we'll move on here. This is looking into North Korea. This is the, hopefully you can see I'm circling it with my arrow here. This is the propaganda village, or whatever they call it. There's a name to it, the small village where people don't live. And then there's the massive flagpole that's 100 feet taller than the South Korean flagpole, which is just off the left of the image here. So there was a lot of up until recently, a lot of one-upsmanship. Oh, we built a village. Oh no, we built a better village, or we built a better flagpole. And up until very recently, there wasn't a lot of north of Uijeongbu and towards Munsan-ni. There wasn't a huge amount of development, but that changed within the last years. And Kaesong is over here to the left, behind this village to the west. You can't see it in this image, but the group where they, with the Sunshine Policy, set up the joint industrial complex in North Korea is literally, actually it's behind this hill here, right down here, if you could see through here, just a couple kilometers away. DMZ comes in here, cuts across, goes in front of the water here. Okay, so here is, let me try and show you. So on the DMZ, actually everywhere on the DMZ, both with ROC units and in this case with an American unit in 1976, the AXE unit where the United States military came in, Operation Paul Bunyan, came in and took down the tree that was right here. I'm circling with my mouse. There's a little marker here at the base of this tree. This is called the Bridge of No Return here. This is where North Korean soldiers attacked and killed, I believe it was 2 service members, a captain and a lieutenant, who came down with a dose and a half to remove a tree which was blocking their view of this location of this guard shack. Why that's significant is the original intent of the JSA was for both sides to be able to function within that space. And when the North Koreans, of course, did that, murdered those 2 American soldiers in 1976, you have a reaction, I believe it was by President Ford, came forward, and B-52s, F-4 Phantoms, moved a whole bunch of assets forward just to cut down the tree that was here that the North Koreans didn't want us to cut down. That is very indicative, and I would argue parallels a lot of things that happens along the DMZ and between North Korea and South Korea. You have a lot of symbolism. The blowing up of the Peace Center or Gate Center a couple months ago. You do something, then we do something. So it's this leapfrogging thing all the way back to before 1976. So that's that. Here's you see I'm circling or pointing to this black spot. That is a speaker, and they're pumping propaganda into South Korea. And of course, you have things like with the hot air balloons that recently went up from North Korean defectors in the South, and how the North Korea reacted by.
Yeah, they're not taking too kindly to
exactly
North Korean defectors putting hot air balloons with DVDs and pictures and magazines and stuff, and just letting them go northward into North Korea for anybody to pick up. They don't take too kindly to that. Yeah, no. So the other thing it's hard to tell in the picture, and maybe we'll have a better one here, is the North Korea in 95, I'm speaking 95 to 96, the North Korean hillsides and countryside are denuded. There's not a lot of growth, there's no trees. Basically everything's gone. Whereas the South Korea is green, usually planted, not so much in the north. Here's some more Korean signs, propaganda signs looking across the DMZ. Here's within the military demarcation line, and this is the MDL itself. This is a bad sign that's probably been there since 1953, indicating the center of the demarcation line. If you walked into the DMZ and you got through everything, you might stumble into this, you might not, but if you went north of it, you could be in trouble for a number of reasons. And you'll see the ROC soldiers patrolling, in this case, South Korean soldiers patrolling both sides of the MDL, or well, this side of the MDL. Here's the Bridge of No Return. I want to say this is checkpoint 6 or 7. I don't remember the exact number. There are currently it's not manned. There's no one in there.
but it gets a regular paint job and the lights get replaced. So if you
Who
want
maintains those? Is that the U.S. Army that maintains them, or is that the
great
Koreans?
question. I don't know. Excellent question. We could find out.
Sure. Ask Google. That's what Google's for.
Email the commander at Camp Boniface and he'll tell you, or she'll tell you. So here we are. Here's a better picture of the tree that got cut down. More of that. Here's a better view of the propaganda village. When I was there in '95, the buildings were basically concrete shells. They're not built out. There's no glass. There's no people walking around in that village, even though they had just put up a new gymnasium and a water tower. It had been there for years. This is actually, if I understand this correctly, the armistice was signed in this building here, just north of Panmunjom. This building it's outside of the JSA and it's on their side of the DMZ. This is a picture so you understand, to give you some more context. This is actually a tunnel under the DMZ, and there are multiple tunnels under the DMZ that were dug by North Koreans and usually ended just before they pop out, just on the north side of the Inchon River. And this is a small one. Most of the, this is just for people, and it wasn't done yet. So most of them were bigger, larger for tanks and artillery, right through the middle of the rock, right to the north side of the Inchon River so that you could make a fast approach, probably with boats to ford the river and get across, or no boats if you're low. But that would have been just north of Munsan. So you have this, and then you have South Korean soldiers, which we're not going to show you here, in the tunnel, actually manning the guard post in the tunnel with explosives, ready to blow the tunnels. So very real, very serious, not a joke. This is me and the crew. You can see here in the fall, this is on one of those hills. So you have very dry conditions in the late fall. You have wet conditions in the spring during the monsoon. So you have all of June, it starts raining. It doesn't stop raining until about 30 days later. So very different climate, very hot, wet summers, very cold winters. I can even say that having grown up in Wisconsin, I have a lot of respect for the Korean winters. You also see here, we have Korean soldiers who are called Katusas, Korean Army training with the United States Army. They are Korean nationals who are organic to your unit, and they form a very important part of what you're able to do and not do. So very helpful both as translators and all the other skill sets that you need. So
how did the average Korean regard the American presence, or how do they, based on your experience?
Well, it's kind of, it's a big question.
You mentioned once there was a generational split.
Yeah, and that's my sense from what I've witnessed. For younger people since '95, they don't have the knowledge going back to the Korean War where their grandparents or parents would have been impacted. So they may not be as excited about having the Americans there. In the case of the Katusas, they're conscripted, and they don't have a choice. They have to be there, or they go back to the Korean Army or the Rock Army. And so I think most of the Katusas were happy to be there, given that within the Korean Army, much tighter discipline, sometimes not as good equipment historically. and a much rougher outlook than the United States Army.
Yeah, I've heard some stories about corporal punishment is a ever-present thing in the South Korean Army.
Absolutely. That happens all the time. Or not all the time. That was one of the things that they mentioned. That was a concern. And they were in our case, those Katusas were happy to be there. And they were very helpful. And I ended up penning an ARCOM on a Korean national for his service with our unit. So very integral to the whole process. He moved to Inchon. So that's me. I'm pointing to the Imjim River up north. That's me. Okay, so this is a good one. So President Moon and the current president, the South Korean president, is focusing, or had focused 2 years ago, I don't know, they may have stopped now, on removing mines from within the DMZ or Diemshida. The one thing that you have south of the DMZ, and you have more minefields. And generally what would happen is these bags that you see here, I'm pointing to with my cursor, is they'd use a bread bag or a rice bag to lift the soil up without breaking the surface, and then slide the landmine in there, and then let the dirt come back down. So you couldn't look at the top of the ground and easily observe that there was a landmine there. So all of your quick approaches or speedy approaches into Seoul, MSR1, MSR3, we're now, this is probably 20 miles, maybe 15 miles south of the DMZ. This is where someone has farmed rice, but you'll see that for whatever reason, they're putting in a string of mines. So that happens every year. They come in, they go out, and so on and so forth. So as you get,
speaking of Seoul, wasn't it I read somewhere that 40%, maybe more, of Seoul and its suburbs are within artillery range of North Korea?
Yeah, and that's why they have shelters, and why generally if you're north of Seoul, it's an unaccompanied tour, which means to someone serving in the military, the U.S. military, your spouse isn't allowed along generally, or partner, because they don't want you getting shelled. So just something to consider. So you have minefields, and then you have these giant concrete structures and bridge explosives on all the bridges and all the approaches, so that if there was ever an attack, and you have Korean soldiers in place to drop those materials, so it'll at least slow down the North Korean advance.
So what you're saying is they're ready to fight tonight, to use a phrase that I've heard many times over there.
Yep, exactly. So we had when I was on Brigade SDO, I got up the 1st Brigade commander because the rock unit to our left was setting off their claymores at the North Koreans. So that's just one example. And you have people who are killed, and it doesn't make the news. It won't, they might be injured. The other thing that happens is, even though we're in peacetime, quote unquote, you'll have soldiers who are killed in accidents, unfortunately, and that happens all the time. So let's go on here. Rice paddies, of course, in the summertime, these are flooded. So most of your approaches are on high-speed roads or railroad. Move on here. The other part to understand about Korea, and you've probably heard this listening to and talking to veterans, is the hilltops. They're not hilltops, they're mountains. They're small mountains. For Wisconsin people, they're mountains. They're very high, very steep. And so, for instance, when we would deploy on one of these hilltops, this is actually the ridge line here. I'm painting with my cursor, showing you. The road is no wider than one Jeep or one Humvee. And if you fall off, you go down hundreds and hundreds of feet. So very channelized for the military historians in the group, very channelized. The hills are important too. You got to have possession of them. But if you're trying to move quick, you can do it. But if you get the hilltops, the key hilltops, it's going to be a while to get you out of there. And then all the leaves will drop. This will be clear. This is myself. This is Lieutenant Ron Simons from Chicago, Illinois. And we're doing the handoff here. We're out somewhere, and it's obviously raining. So, and here we are on the top of the hill. At the beginning of my tour, where I actually think, in this case, I'm doing summers, and the sergeant majors probably said we're doing winters, but I didn't get the message. So, again, here's another high peak, very dusty, very dry, really rough terrain. And
we only have a few minutes left, and I kind of wanted to get to some of these questions that we have coming in from some of our participants today.
Okay.
And I'm hoping that, it's been a while since you've been there, and I'm hoping that some of these questions could get answered in more of a modern sense. Particularly, you were talking about the tree that got cut down and the bridge of no return. And one of the questions is do you know of any other incidents that have happened similar to that, that have taken place, in more recent past, that have kind of mirrored, that sort of attack on a soldier?
Yeah, no, most of them would be, because that's up by the DMZ, and the American forces have pulled back, except for within the JSA. We would probably be looking at Republic of Korea, ROC units, South Korean units. So I don't have any quick examples off the top of my head.
I will say there's a couple of disputed islands, because the DMZ also extends offshore, and the North Koreans have shelled those from time to time. And the other thing is, back in 2010, North Korean submarine, although they officially denied it, the forensic evidence is clear, sunk a South Korean frigate in some disputed waters off the western end of the land DMZ. The Chosin was what she was called, and she sank with heavy loss of life. From an American perspective, Operation Paul Bunyan in 1976 is probably is the one that stands out among all the others. But yeah, they're still going at each other, just on a low intensity scale.
And more from a political standpoint, and I don't know if this is something that we could speak to or not, but one of the questions that came in was that what is the relationship like between the Koreans and Japan today?
Problematic.
Okay, and the question is kind of twofold. It's one half of it is political, the other half of it is social. Is there a difference between how the governments look at each other as opposed to how the people look at each other?
Well, I'll try to carefully capture the question about in terms of the Japanese. Part of the reason why there may be resentment or anger on the part of the Korean people historically was because of how they treated Korean women. In this case, there was during the Japanese occupation, there was some very bad treatment. So that might play into that. That would have been my grandfather's generation. So I'm not sure how that translates to the grandchildren, but that's definitely somewhere in the process. And then,
sorry, Luke, I'll jump in real quick and take something I noticed in today's headlines. As a matter of fact, the ambassador to Japan is a retired admiral named Harry Harris. His mother was Japanese. When he showed up a couple of years ago, there was some static from the people of South Korea saying he's one of them. He's a Japanese, which I thought was very interesting. And he wore a mustache after he retired, and he had it shaved off in a Korean barbershop actually yesterday, as a matter of fact. And that's the story, is because his mustache looked so much like the mustache that a lot of Imperial Japanese officers used during the occupation. There were a lot of people that were saying, "Oh, this guy of Japanese ancestry, even though he's an American, he's here. He's dressed just like them, just like possibly one of his ancestors." So there's still a very strong feeling. In fact, one of the business etiquette books that I found, whenever you give something to a Korean, a gift as part of any sort of business transaction or whatever, make sure it's not made in Japan. Sorry, Luke, I wanted to jump in on that real quick. We'll let you gather your thoughts.
Yeah, so getting to the generally how the Korean people feel versus what their government feels, I really can't speak to that too much. And my experience would have been 25 to 23 years ago. What I can tell you is I spent a lot of time off post, and that's one of the things that happens. Sometimes Americans, when they get overseas, they tend to stay on post and may have not as much interaction as you'd expect. One of the things that was going on, and it is in my, we didn't get to it here in terms of topics, was there are long-term relationships between various American units and Korean nationals. Habitual relationships in terms of both as places to hang out, as help, hired help necessarily, or even in terms of specific families following specific units. So in all those relationships, my experience was always positive and was good. But again, those were people who had been associated and were working with in some way, shape, or form, either informally or formally, or completely ad hoc with the United States military.
And we have a couple questions, Luke, that kind of center on some of the photographs you were showing.
Okay.
The first one talks about the fake village, and what's the point of that fake village? I mean, if everybody knows it's fake, you know, why continue to maintain it and keep it up and actually improve and add on it?
You know, great question. I think to a large extent, this is only speculation on my part, kind of a one-upsmanship between the North and the South. I know that the South had a newer village, i.e. in the 90s, just south of there that was coming along, looked pretty productive. And it had taken years for people to decide north of Uijeongbu to start really coming back in and populating the area and being willing to put up buildings. And I don't know, I suspect it's kind of a one-upsmanship between the North and the South.
Yeah, that's my reading of it too. As Luke said, there's a lot of one-upsmanship and a lot of kind of playing for prestige and posturing on the DMZ. And to me, that village and the other, you know, some of the other stuff that he described is part of that process.
Okay. And then another one was, where did it go? Oh, yes. You showed the picture of the denuded hillside. And somebody was wondering, is that because of, you know, a food famine, or was that denuded for military purposes, or can you speak to why, you know, places like that are devoid of vegetation?
So it's probably a multiplicity of factors. One of the things that happens, and I was just talking to someone about this morning, is as you move towards the DMZ, historically, there were, just following the war in '53, the hills and the mountainsides were completely denuded of trees because of shells, because of fragments, basically not a lot left. So even though it's 70 years later, you have a process of, now it's 70 years later, where smaller trees come in, they grow up, but a lot of there wasn't a lot of good topsoil on most of those mountains. So you'd have scrub come in, we call it jack pine in Wisconsin, and you may not have bigger growth trees. So when I was there in the 90s, you'd have trees maybe at the most this big around, and it wasn't because they'd been burned over or cut over. it was because they were recovering and growing back and going through their cycle. The other part of that is just speculation. 95 and 96, we had, of course, the famine in North Korea, and we had millions of, hundreds of thousands of people that in theory died in North Korea at that time. One of the things that they were doing is part of it was, and I don't know if it was right there, was taking the trees, eating the trees, peeling the inner bark off and using it as food. So no military purpose.
Okay. Well, it is 1 o'clock, and that brings us to the end of our panel discussion. Gentlemen, any closing remarks?
I would just say this is an example when you think history is an ancient and dead topic, consider a case like what we've been talking about, and you realize it's very much alive and very much with us right up to today.
And I'll wrap up by saying I wish the Korean people the best, and I hope for the best results. As a veteran of Korea and all the other veterans who served over there, I wish them the best, and I do hope things work out.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your input today and your expertise. Luke, particularly sharing your personal photos of your time over there. That's not something that a lot of people get to see too often. So it gives us a nice insight as to, the part of the world where we are actively participating as a military and showing folks back home and talking about the situation on the ground and how things really look. We greatly appreciate everybody joining our panel discussion today. And I would invite everybody to go to our website and look for some of our upcoming events, such as our movie night, which is coming up this Friday. If you didn't get a chance to participate in our trivia night last week, we have another one coming up in a few weeks. That was a fantastic success and everybody had a lot of fun. So I would invite everybody to go to our website and look at our programming schedule. There are going to be more panel discussions coming up every other Monday. So in 2 weeks from today, we'll have another panel discussion talking about almost the ending of World War II in the Pacific and the bombings in Japan. Once again, thanks everybody for coming out, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple weeks and at some of our other programs.